I'll never forget the screams. It was a warm spring night in the late 90s, and we were on our way home from our little cabin in the woods. It was old, musty, and a bit dilapidated, but had been in the family for generations, and monthly trips were a well-ingrained family tradition. My dad described it as a good place to unplug from technology and the world, and it was just that. Passing through that rickety screen door was like stepping into another era, despite the lack of modern-day comforts like plumbing or air conditioning. I had always enjoyed the cabin. If my family values one thing, it's tradition. The only complaint I'd ever had about the cabin was a hard time sleeping when I was younger. It wasn't necessarily the ever-present chorus of wildlife, buzzing insects, chirping birds, squirrels crashing through the underbrush. It wasn't my youthful imagination running wild with growling wolves, monstrous bears, or mysterious creatures crashing towards the flimsy walls of the cabin in the dead of the night. What kept me awake was the soft scratching I could always hear underneath the floorboards. It wasn't aggressive, and it wasn't loud. It was persistent, the faint but incessant grinding against the grainy wooden planks. As a young child, I would call out to my mother at night, afraid. She'd sit at my bed and run a hand through my hair reassuringly. "There's no need to be scared, baby. That's just Andy. He wants to come out to play. Just ignore him." This had been a good weekend. The lake was warm enough for swimming, and the fishing was great. This had been a special trip. My high school graduation celebration. We drove home under a bright moon, and I was comfortably leaning my head against a cool glass window. My parents' conversation fading into a dull drone as the streetlights zipped by. I faded in and out, closing my eyes and drifting toward off. The blast of a horn and a devastating explosion violently ripped me from sleep, and nothing would ever be the same again. I was spinning. Broken glass shards flew through the air, tearing, slicing. My mother was screaming. I will never forget those screams. There was blood. The car rolled in what felt like slow motion, finally smashing against a telephone pole and coming to rest. And then, with a gut-wrenching finality, it was over. A dizziness overtook my senses, and blackness blossomed everywhere. I was vaguely aware that I was bleeding, and I felt an intense pressure in my head. It took me a few moments to realize I was hanging upside down, held in by my seatbelt. I could smell the burning stench of deployed airbags and gasoline fumes. "Call 911. The unfamiliar voice sounded like it was underwater. I could hear boots crunching against broken glass. Consciousness began to fade. Mom? My mouth was filled with copper-tasting blood, and I coughed. I couldn't quite comprehend what I was seeing. My parents lay motionless in front of me. My mom looked wrong. Her neck was sickeningly twisted in a direction that isn't possible. Her torso pointed forward, still neatly seatbelted in, but her face was staring directly at me. Her lifeless eyes were wide open, lips twisted in a silent, terrible scream. The car had crumpled in such terrific fashion at the driver's side that I couldn't see my father at all. There was thick, congealed blood and bits of hair that had been forced out of the twisted metal frame against the pavement. The best way I can describe it is if you'd set a tube of toothpaste on the floor and stomp on it. I could see shiny white bits amidst the carnage, and I tried to force myself to not recognize it as pieces of my father's skull. I stared at my dead mother's face for a long time. I couldn't look away. It wasn't until I could hear the screeching of the jaws of life opening the twisted wreck of the car that consciousness faded. "There must be some kind of mistake," I said dumbly. "I don't have a brother." The attorney shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I'm afraid not. And I do apologize for being unfamiliar with your family dynamic. However, the wording is quite clear. We sat in a downtown office suite that overlooked a main thoroughfare through massive glass windows. Can you read it for me again?" My head was spinning. I desire that should I die, it is my wish to be buried according to the rites of the Roman Catholic Church and interred at... Skip down to the next line. He cleared his throat. To my esteemed children, Ethan and Andrew, give and bequeath the following properties to wit. Our cabin location at... He rattled off the address and continued to name bank accounts, the family house, and other assets in official-sounding legalese. I don't have a brother. I don't know who Andrew is, I repeated. The attorney looked sympathetic and slightly awkward as he adjusted his necktie. I understand, Ethan. My investigators are attempting to ascertain this Andrew's whereabouts. He set the papers down on his desk and stared at me. This isn't the first time I have seen an unconventional family dynamic. Why your parents chose not to tell you about your brother is a question I cannot answer, but surely there's a plausible reason. Andy, I muttered. My hands began to tremble. As summer faded into fall and fall into winter, I began to obsess about the existence of Andrew and my mother's explanation of the scratching underneath the cabin. That's just Andy. He wants to come out and play. I had to see for myself. I had to know. I drove southbound under a full moon, clenching my teeth as I passed a mile marker where the crash had occurred. I turned onto the small dirt road that held the cabin. Gravel and dirt spit behind my car into the darkness. All the cabins were all empty at this time of year. No one vacations in the dead of winter. Skeletal tree branches clawed and scraped the side of my car as I pulled up the narrow driveway leading through the choked woods and up to the cabin. The small log cabin had none of its charm that it held in springtime. In the dead of this cold winter night, illuminated by nothing but my Chevy's headlights, it looked menacing, haunting. I clicked on my flashlight and tucked it under an armpit as I fumbled with the keys. My breath frosted in the frigid air. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. I stopped and listened closely. It was there, faint but present, soft scratching from underneath the floorboards. The hair stood up on the back of my neck, and my heart began to beat faster. A heavy padlock secured the small door leading to the crawl space underneath the cabin. A little key accompanied the larger front door key on the keyring. It slid into the padlock easily. The little door groaned as I pulled inward, and the padlock clattered to the floor. A stench assaulted my senses, and I fought to keep my lunch down. It stank of rotten meat. It stank of death. My heart beat even faster. The small flashlight cast a pitiful beam of yellow light into the icky blackness that stretched downward, into the bowels of the cabin. The wooden steps creaked and groaned under my feet as I descended underground, the beam of light now trembling wildly across the moldy walls and uneven dirt floor. Tree roots protruded in some areas. The ceiling of the crawlspace was crisscrossed, with thousands of shallow gouges and scratches. As I gagged on the foul odor, the beam of my flashlight illuminated the creature in a sickly yellow light. It sat on its haunches deep in the shadowed recesses of the crawlspace. I froze. Bile rose into the back of my throat, and blackness emmed into my vision as adrenaline dumped. It softly scratched on the ceiling with bony fingers that were too long. Its skin, white as curdled milk and horribly smooth, glowed against the flashlight. It didn't seem to notice me as it continued its relentless scratching on the ceiling with bloody and worn-down fingertips. Its ribs jutted out from malnutrition. It was vaguely human in composition, but at the same time, totally otherworldly. Its eyes were completely white, like a cave-dwelling beast. I gagged again, and that's when it noticed me. It snapped toward me, enlarged nostrils flaring angrily. I could hear a barely perceptible sniffing as it cocked its head and scrambled toward me at an astonishing speed. It used its hands as much as its legs in the cramped confines of the crawlspace, as a gorilla would. The way it moved was all wrong. It was fluid but primitive, like some kind of reptile. I screamed again, dropping the flashlight and scrambling up the staircase. I could hear a soft grunt as the creature hit the stairs, only a few feet behind me and closing the distance fast. That thing was so terribly quiet. A cold, wet hand wrapped around my ankle like an eel. I felt another massive adrenaline dump, and I lashed out with my free foot, catching the creature in its head. It tumbled down the staircase silently, the blackness totally enveloping it. I plunged out of the crawl space, slamming the door shut and leaning against it, breathing heavily. "Dad," my son called from the bedroom. It had been many years since my encounter with Andy, and try as I might, I simply could not connect the dots as to why my parents had kept my deformity of a brother hidden away in a crawl space, imprisoned, their dirty secret. I went to my son's bed and sat down, his little frame not even taking up half the bed. Moonlight spilled through the open window, illuminating the room. "Shh," I said as I ran a reassuring hand through his hair. "Dad, the scratching again," he whined. "It's okay, pal," I said. "That's just Uncle Andy. He wants to play. Just ignore him. Besides, we're headed back home tomorrow." I got used to Andy's scratching, and my son would get used to it too. He settled down and fell back asleep quickly. I sat next to him for a while, listening to the soft scratching and smiling at the absurdity of it all. I think most people would have sold the cabin, or maybe burned it down to the ground, but I wasn't raised that way. I was raised with tradition, and if my family values one thing, it's tradition.